Welcome to Inspirational Journeys, everyone. My name is Ann Harrison, and today I'm proud to introduce my special guest, Dr. Linville in Meadows. But before we get started, I do want to remind you, if you're watching this on YouTube, to go and subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so that you don't miss another video, and do like the video and share it with your friends. If you're listening on the podcast, be sure to subscribe so that you get notified every time I post a new episode. Welcome to the show, Lynn.
Thank you, Ann. It's a real joy to be here today.
It's a joy to have you on the show, and especially since we started talking before we got started recording. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a retired oncologist. I used to take care of cancer patients. I'm a recovering addict and alcoholic, which means I don't drink anymore, and I try to find a way to lead a better life. I grew up in Florida. I went to University at Duke. I went to UNC Medical School, which is 8 miles down the road. I did my house staff and oncology training at Duke, and then went back to UNC where I was on the faculty for a while. Back when I was a young person, I'm a child of the 60s, and we spent time trying to enlarge our consciousness, and we used all different manner of drugs to do that. I don't think that we ever really did enlarge our consciousness, and after a while we just did it to get stoned. But when I went to school, I didn't really have the time or the inclination to be involved in drugs and alcohol. I went through all those years of training and actually had a really good time. I'm a perpetual student. When I was on the faculty at the medical center, we would have these recruiting dinners, and my boss was very much into really good red wines, and so we would have a glass of wine with dinner, and I discovered that the glass of wine gave me the same buzz that the pot used to do. Pot was my favorite, of course, and that began the slow and very slippery and completely unnoticeable slide into alcoholism. A glass of wine at dinner became two. I mean, after all this work that I'd gone through, all this study, I was entitled to the good life, wasn't I? And so it seemed like a perfect thing to do, to have wine. And I never realized it. It slid from one glass to 2 glasses of wine every night, to a bottle of wine every night, to 2 bottles of wine every night. And I wouldn't leave home without carrying 2 bottles of wine with me and a corkscrew. It got to the point where I wouldn't stop at a restaurant for lunch unless they had a wine list. Okay, that's getting pretty bad.
Mm.
Now, I was also addicted to cocaine, and it was a party favor for a long time, until suddenly it wasn't a party favor anymore. I guess you could say that I'd never realized when all this was happening. After a while, though, there's this invisible line that you cross, where you go from being someone who uses a lot to someone who is actually a full-blown addict or alcoholic. I like to use the term addict to cover both, because basically I'm addicted to alcohol as my drug, and I'm addicted to cocaine as my other drug. There's an invisible line that you cross over, where you go from being someone who uses a lot or drinks a lot, but can stop whenever they want. When you cross this invisible line, something happens to your body, where no longer do you have the choice. Once across that line, I take one drink and I can't stop. It triggers something inside me. I can't stop until either I pass out or we run out of get highs. The other thing that happens is I develop this terrible craving that comes on out of the clear blue sky. I'll suddenly decide that I have to have my drug of choice, and I can't stop until I get it. And then when the first line, the first hit, the first drink goes in, there is no stopping me. Now and you can never go back across that line to being someone who uses a lot of drugs but really isn't addicted. The old timers like to say that a grape that a raisin can never go back to being a grape, that a pickle can never go back to being a cucumber. Once you cross that line, that's the end of it. You have completely lost the power of choice over drugs and alcohol. The same, it's very much like diabetes in many ways. You can inherit a tendency to diabetes. That doesn't mean you'll ever get it. You can eat a lot of sugar, but that doesn't make you a diabetic. Okay. Well, there is an invisible line that someplace I cross over where all of a sudden I'm a diabetic, and I'm not a potential diabetic where I can eat sugar anytime I want. Once I cross over that line into diabetes, if I eat any kind of pies or cakes, my blood sugar is going to go up. And it doesn't matter how well I take care of it. For 20 years, once I start eating pies or cakes again, the blood sugar is going to go right back up. I can never go back from being a diabetic to being a pre-diabetic, or I can have a slice of cake without consequences. And so addiction is very much like that. It's chronic, it's relapsing, and untreated, it's uniformly fatal, regardless of the kind of what you might be addicted to. I can be addicted to many things. They say if I can do it twice and it doesn't kill me, I can become addicted to it. When a person crosses that line, maybe they only drank alcohol. Once across that line, I become susceptible to any get high you can name. So if I were an alcoholic, I'm a wino. But as a wino, once I cross that line, any kind of addictive drug will hit me and take me away. There's a story of a famous actor who had been clean and sober from alcohol for like 20 years. And one day he suddenly decided he wanted to have a glass of wine with dinner. And the next thing you know, they find him dead with a syringe full of heroin in his arm where he had overdosed. So that one crossing the line, that one is now susceptible to everything. In fact, when I go to have a procedure done of some kind, medical procedure, I tell them I cannot take benzodiazepines, I cannot take narcotics, because either of those can trigger a relapse. I had one of my first psychiatrists was a really nice lady who went in the hospital once. She was actually had been a heroin addict, believe it or not, while she was in medical school. And she'd been clean and sober from heroin for over 15 years. And she went into the hospital to have her gallbladder taken out. And they gave her a morphine pump where you push a little button and it gives you a dose of morphine.
Mm-hmm.
And they left it on her a day too long, and she kept pushing it until she actually relapsed off of the medicine that had been prescribed by her kind physicians. So there's a danger there. You have to actually be an advocate for your own sobriety.
Wow, that's amazing. So I would ask you what inspired you to become a writer, but let's take it one step further. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, two things. One was when I was in college, I was really in love with being a writer, and I was an English major. And then I hit my first episode of bipolar disease, and I ended up flunking out of college. And I ended up going back to school, taking zoology and biology and biochemistry type courses so I could get into medical school, because I liked sciences as much as I liked literature. The reason I decided to write this book.
Sorry.
Huh?
I am so sorry. My phone's. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The reason I decided to write this book was that when I was in rehab, one of the things that I learned, much to my surprise, was that prayer actually works. As a scientist and a physician, people don't talk about higher powers or prayer or anything like that. It's easier to talk about your mistress when you're working in the emergency room than it is to talk about God. So when I came to rehab, they said, you have to learn how to pray. And I said, wait. I'm not sure I even believe in God. And I certainly don't know how to pray. And they said, that doesn't matter, just do what we tell you. And so I got to where I would pray at night and ask questions. One night I prayed and asked the question, how what am I supposed to do when I get out of here? Because I was pretty sure I didn't want to go back to medicine, because medicine in many ways fed into my addiction. And the next morning, I woke up and there were two words sitting on my belly, staring me in the face, and they were live free. All right. Well, how do you live free? I mean, like I said, I'm an old hippie, so free love, free sex, free dope, that kind of stuff, that didn't work. It couldn't possibly be that. So a couple weeks later, I prayed again. What am I supposed to do when I get out of here? And the next morning, there were two words sitting on my belly, and they were to live freely. And it took me 2 years to figure out what that meant. It means to live for your fear, which is absolutely one of the most important things in terms of having a happy life that's filled with serenity and peace and joy, is to overcome all the fear in your life. Another time I prayed and I said, well, I said the same question again, what am I supposed to do when I get out of here? And the next morning I got this message sitting on, for sometimes I get words on my stomach staring up at me, you know? And it was tell our story. Okay, so I began working on it a long time ago, but it's taken me a long time to actually write it for a number of reasons. And I put together all the stories that I had heard, and I put together all the lessons that I had learned, and then I took and built them into the form of a memoir, so that there's very personal stuff in it, but it's also a sort of a textbook, a guidebook to learn about the disease of addiction and to learn what I can do about it. And it's almost a step-by-step approach, at least that's the way I put it. And I took the stories that I had heard and the lessons that I had learned and put them into the mouths of the men and women that were around me as we went through rehab. And then a couple of years ago, a friend of mine, who was one of the few people that I still keep up with out of rehab, and I were talking, and he's a personal coach, and he's really good at it. And he said, Lynn, if you're not going to do this now, when are you going to do it? And I went, I think you're right. So I made a decision. I made a choice that I'm going to go ahead and finish writing it. I'm going to go ahead and publish it, and I'm going to work on the promotion of the book until, to give it a year, basically a year and a half of working on it to some degree every day. And that's what I've been doing since last March. All right. So the pandemic didn't hurt me, and it made it much easier to concentrate, actually.
Probably did. I can understand that. And are you talking about, because I've read your stories, and I can tell you're a great storyteller, because that's what kept me interested in it. It was not like it was not textbookish.
Right.
It was totally. So were you talking about Mike, who you first met?
Yes, of course, it's Mike. Now, all the names are not the same.
Oh, I know that, but.
And sometimes I took two people that I knew and I combined them into one character.
Oh, yeah.
Jane is a person in my mind. I've never met her, all right, but she jumped in my head so clearly that I had to put her in there. She represents the very strict approach to recovery, where you must follow these rules very keenly, and she was very she had a fund of knowledge that was essential to really finding a decent recovery. When I talk about recovery, what I mean is that I think there are stages in one's journey to get rid of drugs and alcohol. The first stage is simply to quit drinking or smoking or using, and I call that abstinence, because you're not using. And that's good. That's better than using. But if a person doesn't approach the underlying problems of addiction, they're not going to get very far. As a disease, addiction affects the mind and the body and the spirit. And whatever type of treatment you apply has got to address all three of these. So if I just quit drinking, my mind will clear up to some degree. The toxic effects of the drugs and alcohol will eventually leave the body. Some effects are permanent, like cirrhosis or brain damage or any number of things, and those may never clear up. The body itself will get better once you remove the poisons. The brain, the mind will take a lot longer to relearn how to live, but you also have to address the problems of the spirit, which is to say, um, uh, I, over time, gave up all of my closely held altruistic moral principles because they got in the way of my using. If it was, should I should I pay the rent, which is $300, or should I go buy a whole big thing of cocaine and pot and party all night? Well, the decision, any normal person would say, pay the rent, idiot. But once that addiction comes, there is no choice. You go and you buy the dope, okay? And over time, I found that I gave up essentially all of the moral principles, all of the altruism that led me to be a physician in the first place. Um, I gave up my professional values anytime that they got between me and my use. So that has to be addressed, and it it what it requires is that I develop a whole new way of looking at the world, a whole new way of thinking, which leads to a whole new way of behaving. You have talked about being born again. Well, that's exactly what this is. It's being born again in a different sense than many Christians would use the word, but it's nonetheless the same thing. It's a complete rearrangement of everything that I hold dear. Or I used to hold dear when I was using. When I got into rehab, they told me everything you think you know is wrong. Not how to drive from Atlanta to Rochelle, or from Rochelle to Jacksonville, or how to change a tire. But
Mhm.
everything you know about behaving and thinking has been completely messed up by your drinking and using. Um, and so I had to learn a new way of looking at the world. They said you have to find a higher power. And by that they meant some sort of higher power that I could relate to, not what the preacher related to, or what the priest told me, or what the rabbi told me, that how they thought the world was ordered. But I had to find it out for myself. And
Mm.
they gave us a worksheet. All right. And if you're going to define a higher power that you can relate to, what would it be? And these two words popped into my head, and they were unconditional love. And that's not a term that I had heard only one. I'd only heard it once in my life, almost 20 years before. But if you start out with the idea that the universe is based on the principle of unconditional love, then a whole lot of things come out of that. Um, uh, I am beloved by my higher power. Um, I the things that I possess that make me in the image of my higher power are stuff like honesty, kindness, creativity, compassion. That's who I am. And the using basically kept all these good things from coming uh, from the universe, from God, from whatever word you want to use, into me and out through me into the world. Um, the Buddhists like to use the term dharma, Dharma,
Mm.
and the saying is to follow your dharma. All right. In the Buddhist literature, that dharma is the underlying nature of the universe. It is the laws, the principles that necessarily derive from the way the universe, from the way existence is structured. It's how I relate to those laws and those ideas, how I behave in the world based on those ideas, and it's the results that I produce in the world based on those behaviors. The other way of saying that, which is an AA saying, is let go and let God, which is that I have to move my ego out of the way and let the universe flow through me. And when I do that, then that's where inspiration comes from. When I'm writing something and I get stuck, I close my eyes and I just move the ego a bit and sit back. And then I open my eyes and I'm off writing again, just that quickly, by moving my ego out of the way. Let go
Mhm.
and let God. Um, Joseph Campbell said you should follow your bliss. And what he meant by that was follow this pathway, right? Mike, the guy that is very prominent in the book, once told it to me another way. He said, um, "You are a child of God, and your job in this life is to bring God's love into the world." And it's three different ways of saying the same thing. So that what I got out of seeing these different things like that was that spiritual truth is where you find it. All right. If you trace back, I did a lot of study of the Eastern religions and other religions, and the same principles are there. It's just that men in search of power and prestige and position have altered the word into something that helps them with their ideas of how they should rule the world. And it's happened every time. I think you can see it in uh, any number of sources. Buddhism. Buddha didn't want to be treated as some kind of prophet or anything. Yet you go by a statue of the Buddha and you rub his belly because that's In Tibet they have prayer flags and prayer wheels to pray to the Buddha. Well, Buddha wasn't some higher power or something. He was just a sage who discovered something and shared it with the world. You can make the same argument for the Christian religion that somehow if you were born without Jesus saving you, you must go to hell. Well, or go to limbo or something. But see, that doesn't fit with the idea of unconditional love. Jesus said, "It is not my Father's will that even one of these little ones should be lost." All right. You have one daughter, right, Sharon?
Yeah.
I have 4 kids. And let's say I'm God today, and I have to decide who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. Which of my 2 daughters am I going to send to hell? Well, the answer is none of them. Jesus said that if you love your children a lot, if your child asks for a loaf of bread, will you give him a stone? No. And then he says, and your Father in heaven, if you are imperfect, how much more must your Father in heaven love you and want to give you the kingdom? And it's only me that stands in the way of that happening, of letting that love flow through me and into the world. And one of the things is that the more I learn to do that, the better life becomes in every way that you can think of. One day, my wife and I were going into town, and we had a list of about 6 stops we wanted to make. And one of them, you had to be there before 2, and one didn't open till 1:30. And this one was on one side of town, that was on the other side of town. And she was starting to get all bound up in all these things she had to do. And she was developing a perfect snit. And so I took a napkin and I covered up the clock on the car. All right. And just proceeded without any knowledge of the clock and let the universe guide us through the details of the day. And we hit everything on time and got everything absolutely done perfectly. All right. And that's the simple example. My kids, my son would go into a parking lot and looking for a parking space, and he would go, "Rah, rah, 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 I'll never find a parking space." And he didn't. But my daughter, on the other hand, would go into the parking lot and she would start singing, "I'm going to find a parking place. I'm going to find a parking place." And she always found a place up right near the door where she wanted to go in.
You say you're not going to do it is when it's not going to happen. But if you say you're going to do something, then that's when it happens.
Yes. If I block that flow through my ego and through the fear that feeds the ego, the more I believe that something is going to happen, the more I put my attention into something, the more likely it is to work, which is really kind of interesting. And I wouldn't certainly wouldn't have considered that in the past. But whatever I focus my attention on, I actually bring to me. All right. If I focus my attention on getting into medical school, I do the necessary things, I keep it in front of me, and I draw it to me. And this guy who flunked out of school, spent years trying to get himself back together, ends up in medical school and graduates with honors because I let it happen. All right. I can remember thinking that when I decided to go back to school, I had almost 2 years of undergraduate work, and I had absolutely no money. And I calculated how much child support it would take for me to just to get through undergraduate school, nothing about medical school. It was like $12,000. Well, at that point in my life, I never even had $1,000 in my bank. But I said, no, I'm going to do it anyway, without any idea of how to do it, and it worked out. I mean, I'm living proof of that. The more you believe in the thoughts that you put out into the world, the more likely they are to come back to you. All right. Throw your bread on the waters and it will come back to you after many days. Throw my thoughts out into the ether, out into the universe, however you want to think about it. And they will.
Big yellow buttery balls of love.
Yes, that works. That works. Yeah, yeah. Great big yellow buttery balls of love is an idea that came to me. If I'm having trouble with somebody, like for example, my mother-in-law, and I know that when I go to see her for Sunday dinner, she's just going to give me a hard time. I mean, you know. So when I get down, when I pull up in close to the driveway, I will think of this great yellow ball about the size of a beach ball, right?
Mm-hmm.
And covered in yellow buttery love, and it's just dripping with love. And I rear back and throw it, all right? And it's like a cruise missile. It doesn't have to know where to go. It figures it out all by itself. And then I saw my mother-in-law standing there in her kitchen, and it smacked her right on top of the head, and all this gooey yellow buttery love just pours down all over her, and it makes me laugh. And that's what breaks the spell of the negativity in my head. And when I go inside, I can tell you that that what happens will go better than it would have otherwise. Now, what am I actually doing here? All right. What I am doing is I am sending God's blessing to this person. That's all that it is. It's just in a form that I can use it easily without trying to sound too pious. Okay. I had a friend, he's sort of a friend who was in really bad shape. He had PTSD and all other kind of things. And he was having trouble with his parents. And so I gave him this tool to use. And I didn't hear from him for a couple of years. And he called me, and he was going into a nursing home because he had developed this weird, unusual neurologic thing where he was losing control of his arms and legs and his speech. And
Mm-hmm.
they clearly only had a few months left to live. And he called me because he wanted to tell me that every time he felt bad, he thought about those great big yellow buttery balls of love, and it made him feel better. Okay.
That just made me laugh because I could see that
It's
in
very
my
big.
head.
Yeah. And I've used it many times, and it always works. It may not work like right away, but it's like throw your bread on the waters. And after some time, the universe doesn't operate on my time, you know?
No, God's time is not our time.
Yes,
I can tell you
exactly.
that. I think it's a day is 1,000 years according to
I don't,
God's time.
it's
I don't know,
they're
but
not
I don't.
the same. I can't request something and say, I want it by tomorrow at 5 o'clock, you know?
Nope,
That
doesn't work
doesn't
that way.
work. That doesn't work.
And I like the fact that you said that in when you were talking about in your book about recovery, you have to take baby steps. I see that in every aspect of life.
Yes.
Anytime you learn something new, whatever, you still have to take those baby steps. And I was going to ask you, how long were you in rehab? I know you mentioned 6 months at one point.
It was almost 8 months. Normally for physicians, when you go to a rehab, it's a place that's designed especially for doctors and nurses, and because their problems are much different than a normal person. For example, it takes me a month to figure out that I'm not the doctor anymore. Now I'm the patient. The arrogance that we bring with us is immense, you know. It's not that doctors think they are God, they are God. um, and so you have to get through a lot of that stuff before you can even get to a point where you can receive the treatment. And the treatment is the same for everybody because the disease is the same. The disease is very democratic. It doesn't care where you were born. It doesn't care how much money your daddy has, what car you drive, or where you get to school, and what you do for a living. You could be a dock worker or a waitress or a high school coach. It doesn't matter. 10% of the general population has the seeds to become addicted to something and have it overwhelm them. And that includes 10% of all physicians. Okay. The thing about being a physician who's addicted, you can't tell anybody because you would lose your medical license. You can't share your problems with anybody because they'll think you're less than. Okay, so that you get involved, that you become more and more isolated as you get deeper and deeper into your addiction, and you cannot ask for help. You would just never consider doing that.
Mm. Mm-mm-mm. That sounds rough.
Can be, yeah, it's fatal. It's a fatal disease.
Right.
I can
And
remember thinking that I was I was living in a house. It was very expensive, driving a brand new car, all of the kind of material things around me. And I knew that I was going to die chasing the dope man down a dark alley someplace. All right. That I was never going to be able to quit the cocaine. And some days I wanted passionately to quit. And some days I just didn't care. But I knew that everything that I'd worked for was going down the tubes, and I just didn't care. You reach a point where it becomes either quit or die. And that's where I was. I wouldn't have been able to do it though, because I couldn't help. The thing of it is, you can't help yourself. You can't pick yourself up by your own bootstraps and get sober, because it affects all three aspects of a human being. You can't think yourself into sobriety, because that won't help with any of the other things that are going on.
And that's, you said, your character said in your book, your thinker's broken.
Yes, yes. By the time I get to rehab, my thinker is broken, which means to say that it made perfectly good sense to drive down the highway at 65 miles an hour with a needle in my arm shooting up cocaine. That sounded completely normal at the time. Well, that's not normal. Okay. It affects my filter. We all have filters that help us get rid of the noise. For example, the noise in a restaurant, the sirens outside the window, that we filter those out. But I adapted my filter so that it filtered out anything that might come between me and my using. For example, the judge says, you're an alcoholic, you got to quit. And I go, yeah, sure. Okay, well, maybe not. And it filters out anything that would come between me and my using. And the last part is that I have an overactive forgetter. Okay, so if it gets through my filter somehow, I can immediately forget what it is and just go on about my business. Okay. Between the three of those, they're all basically forms of denial, where I deny that I'm sick, and I deny the effects that my using is having on the people around me, and I deny what's happening to my body and my life. Denial is a useful thing. I can remember a patient who was dying of cancer. He'd gone through surgery, radiation, a couple rounds of chemo, and he was literally days to weeks away from dying. And it was all he could do to get from the wheelchair up to the exam table. And yet we would talk, and he said, I remember he says, Doc, when we get through with all of this, I'm going to go to Jamaica for a couple of weeks and lay out in the sun and enjoy the beach and the water, knowing full tilted. He couldn't even hardly get in the car. So that was not going to happen.
Yeah.
When overcome with stuff that we really have trouble dealing with, denial is a useful mechanism. So he was using denial to make it possible for him to get up, take his medicines, put on his pants, shave, all that kind of stuff. But as addicts and alcoholics, denial is poison for us, because it prevents us from seeing what's happening to us and what we're doing to the people around us.
Wow. Yeah, there were definitely some parts of the book that stuck in my mind. You definitely, and you gave me a glimpse of what people go through. Do you have, first of all, do you have any tips for other listeners out there who either, I don't know if they may be suffering from that, or they know somebody who's suffering from it? Do you have any a word of advice?
Well, a lot of words of advice. The first and perhaps most important thing is that no one is going to go through the process of completely changing everything they know unless they're pushed to the wall. You cannot tell somebody they're an alcoholic and expect them to change because of that. You cannot list all the problems that they have or how bad they've hurt other people around them, their wives, their children, their coworkers, and expect that to have an impact on them. A person must be ready to quit before they will be able to quit. They have to have a desire to change their lives that's just as strong as a desire that they had to get wasted. So that you can't expect somebody, just because they're addicted and they're in trouble, they're living on the street, you can't pull them in and say, you're going to go to rehab and that's going to fix you, because it won't. Until somebody is ready to start, until they've reached that bottom, the quit or die point, You can talk to them until you're blue in the face and send them to rehab 50 times. It's not going to make a difference. That's the key. You have to want to change. And you can't, the other thing is you can't do it by yourself. For some reason, we just don't have the capacity to change our thinking and our behavior and to clear the mind of all the poisons that are there. We simply can't do it by ourselves. I can remember when my nurses figured out that I was in trouble, and they figured out what it was, and they said, "Go home, Doc. We'll take care of this for you." And so I knew when I came to work the next day, it was going to be the end of the world. The medical police were going to be there with their shiny badges, and they're going to put me in handcuffs and take me away, take my medical license off the wall, and lock me up forever. Well, that didn't happen. It turns out that in North Carolina, where I was, there's a thing called the Physicians Recovery Network. And what they do is they intercede between you and the medical board, realizing that you're an impaired physician, and then they send you to a place where you can get the physician-specific rehab, like I talked about before. So when I got there, and that way, if you complete the program, then you don't lose your license. But if you don't, that's it. They give your name to the board, and you're out. So that next morning, when I went to work, I met this guy called Paul. All right. He did not have handcuffs or a badge. He was dressed in regular clothes, and he gave me this strange grin, which I thought was really bizarre. It turns out he was in his own personal form of serenity that he'd gotten out of his recovery, and he gave me a hug. And I thought, what kind of weirdos this gives hugs? People they don't know. And he said, "Lynn, do you have a problem?" And I had what they call a moment of clarity, and I simply said yes. And he said, "Do you want to do something about it?" And you would think that in medical school they would have some course on addiction and stuff like that, but they don't. There was nothing absolutely at all. We learned about the consequences of alcohol, cirrhosis, cardiomyopathy, all the other things that alcohol can do to the body, but absolutely nothing about how to treat the disease itself. So I said, yes, I want to do something about it, but I had no idea what he was talking about. So he put me in his car and he took me to detox, and I was there for 4 days, and then they sent me from there out to rehab. Now, in the years that I've had this wonderful sobriety and this wonderful recovery, I've had many people like Paul come up to me and help me, that I reached out for help, and they took my hand and pulled me up a little bit further. So there have been dozens and dozens of those. And I don't remember their names, but I certainly remember Paul. And I owe these people, I owe Paul and all the other people who reached out to me, I owe them a debt because they basically saved my life when I was dying. And so the reason to write the book is, besides being told to write our story, the reason to write that book is to repay some of the debt that I owe to those people who saved my life. And I'm never going to make any money off the book, but as an ebook, I can give it away to anybody who wants it. The idea is to carry the message that living by spiritual principles will solve all of my problems. I was at an AA meeting with my friend Robert, and we were talking about why we still went to AA meetings. And one of the reasons that I would go would be because I know all the people in that room. They all have been in the same place. We have all sat in the same chair, being scared to death and not knowing what to do. It's the one place in life where I don't have to wear a mask. They all know what I am. They all know where I came from, and we're all the same, and we're there to help each other. Another thing I discovered quite unexpectedly is that when my thinking gets all tangled up, when I go to a meeting and take a big grab of what's in the room, the commonality, it straightens out my thinking. And then Robert spoke and he said, well, I come to meetings to carry the message. Well, the message is not don't drink, all right? Because not drinking is just being abstinent. I'm just a dry drunk. It has to be more than that. And it suddenly occurred to me that the real message that we carry is that living by spiritual principles will solve all of our problems, not just in life, but especially our addiction. All right. Once I do that, my addiction has no chance of penetrating my serenity to pull me down again. And what are the spiritual principles that we're talking about? Not some kind of pie in the sky, cherubs playing harps and white horses pulling golden chariots through the sky and that kind of stuff. No, I'm talking about things that are practical and I can use every day in my life. Things like honesty, kindness, compassion. Those ideas, when I put them in my head, when I focus my attention on them, they become stronger and stronger inside me. And then it becomes easier and easier to, as Mike said, bring God's love into the world. And as the Buddhists say, follow your dharma. And as Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. Um, and it makes all the difference in the world. I would never have believed it.
Mm. So are you working on, as far as your writing, are you working on anything else new?
Well, I have another book that I'm working on. It's only titled New Book at the moment, where I take the ideas that we've talked about. What is Dharma? What is unconditional love? And just simply working through them in a form that writes down and organizes all of these different scattered thoughts. I have 3 novels that are sitting and waiting for me to go back to them.
Oh, okay.
One of them is called A Madness of the Heart, and it's about a young man who has he's obsessive compulsive and he obsesses on women. All right, and he's a good guy. He was an English major and very smart guy. And he obsesses on this one woman, and he just lets the obsession run his life. He eventually ends up chasing her to Honduras, of all places, because this woman is Lucy is her name, and she was always a sort of far left girl, and she actually went to Cuba and learned from those guys how to be a revolutionary. So he hears that she's in Honduras, and he goes to try to find her, and he gets deeper and deeper into the jungle. And the deeper he gets into the jungle, the more insane he becomes. The darkness, the evil, the pure evil of the jungle overwhelms him completely. All right. And he much like the heart of darkness, he discovers the deepness and the darkness and the blackness and the monster within himself. And he escapes with his life, but not much else.
Wow. So you're going to have to let me know when you get one of these novels published, when you do a new book, so we can have you back on the show to talk about some of your other writing. And I do appreciate you sharing your recovery story, because it's one of those, a story of hope.
Yes.
Yes. And
it has to. I go into a room and I'm afraid. I don't believe I'm like these guys at all, and I don't want to be there. And then somebody gets up and tells my story, just as if I had written down the things that happened to me and handed it to him, and he'd read them out loud. So this guy, who I've never met before, knows exactly what happened to me. And then I think, well, I can trust this guy. All right. And once I learn to trust this guy, and I see that he's doing pretty good a few months or a year down the road, then I find hope that in fact something good could happen to me. And so trust leads to hope, and hope leads to opens the door to the pathway of recovery. Hope is essential, but I don't have it when I'm using. I am completely hopeless, a hopeless state of mind and body, they say.
so do you have any advice for aspiring authors out there?
It's not for me to tell people what to do. The one thing that I've discovered is that the more I get my ego out of the way, the more the inspiration that's within me comes out. And I don't come up with the words. They flow through me, and I write them down as fast as I can. And my job then later is to go back and edit out the mistakes I made in my transcription. All right. So if I let that flow through me rather than use my mind to try to figure out how this is supposed to happen, it goes much better. And the other thing is that you have to have a structure within your stories in order to to support the things that happen. That's not to say that you plot out every detail or anything, or to take away your creativity, but you need to know that in chapter 1, this happens. You need to know in chapter 2, here's how he gets us to part 3, and here's what happens in part 3. As Plato said, a story has 3 parts: a beginning, a middle, and an end. And structure is really essential if you're gonna be able to tell a story that doesn't fall apart.
Right. That's why I like using the snowflake method, because it helps me. I don't plot out every single detail, but it helps me keep track of the story structure, the types of scenes, the characters, all that good stuff.
Yeah. I'm still learning about dialogue and how to make a character that's real.
Yeah.
James, most real character I've ever made up.
Wow. So, where can people find you online?
I have 2 websites. One is called A Spiritual Pathway to Recovery, and that talks about the book, it talks about me. My blog site is also at that location. I'm on social media in a lot of different places, usually as either Linville Meadows or as The Answer is Recovery. I have another website that's devoted to understanding the disease of addiction and understanding the treatment, how to guard against relapse, stuff like that. And it's called The Answer is Recovery. When Mike and I would sit around and talk, we would say, one of us would say, "What's the problem?" And then the other would say, "The problem is addiction." And then he would say, "Well, what's the answer?" And the answer is recovery. And that's where that title comes from. The problem is addiction. The answer is recovery.
Okay, so we challenge you to go out there and read to get inspired, write something inspiring, and share your creation with the world. For when you've touched one life, you've touched thousands. Thanks for joining us on Inspirational Journeys, and have a blessed day, everyone.